I'd like to welcome everybody here today. We'll be using the webinar system on Zoom, which I imagine after the last 12 or 18 months, everybody's pretty familiar with. If you could put your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom, I will attempt to get through as many of those as we can. If you put them in the chat, I'll try and transfer them, but I can't guarantee, depending on the volume of chat, whether they'll get lost or not. So if everybody's happy with the way we're doing this, first of all, I'd like to say that Farmers for Climate Action acknowledges the traditional owners of the land in which we work and the traditional owners of the land of our guests and speakers that are joining us. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to say that normally I live on Wiradjuri land at Harden, but today, and I'm not entirely sure, but I think I'm in Ngunnawal land in Canberra, but somebody can correct me on that if I'm not right about that. Now I'd like to thank Jason for giving up his time today to come and explain to us about how acid soils can be treated and how they might impact on carbon sequestration. I understand that the current research he's doing hasn't been completed, and he'll have more information about this later in the year or next year. But Jason has had 25 years in this field, and so I think he'll have plenty to contribute. He actually works at, why can't that come up? He works at CSU, and he's done work on soil sequestration, acid soils, a whole lot of different research projects. And he's currently working on a series of projects optimising acid soil management in southern New South Wales. So if you learn nothing else today, you might learn how to save yourself a bit of money on how much lime to apply at any one time. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jason to tell us what he knows about acid soils. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks very much, Peter. Hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Rightio. Yeah, so thanks for having me, and welcome everyone. Just want to acknowledge on the screen there, we've got some funding organisations and also collaborating organisations that we work with. And so a lot of the stuff I'm talking about today couldn't happen without those people. And it's a great amount of work that's being done at the moment, and there's a lot of contributors to that. So just to start very broadly, when we talk about acidity, we're talking about low pH soil. So we measure it as pH, but the H bit is the important bit. That's the acid, and it's hydrogen. And so it's the power or the potential of hydrogen is pH. And it's a scale going from 0 to 14, where anything less than 7 is acid and anything greater than 7 is alkaline. But that's kind of academic. In soil land, where I come from, soils mostly exist between about 4 and 9. And so depending on where you are, type of soil you have, you'll fit in there somewhere. We care about this because it affects plant growth. So in this little picture below, it's the same soil, it's just had the pH change. There's clover growing in there, and clearly you can see pH matters. And so that's why it's an issue. It affects plant growth. How it does that is there's multi-factors to that. One of the major ones is aluminium toxicity. And to give you an idea of what that is and why it's important, I'm going to show you a graph. We've got soil pH measured in calcium chloride on the x-axis, and we've got what we call aluminium percent on the y-axis. And this is in soil, you have parts of soil that can hold nutrients. And we measure the ability of soil to hold nutrients as the cation exchange capacity. So this y-axis is saying, what is the percentage of the cation exchange capacity that is taken up by plant available aluminium? And just to give you the tip, aluminium, plants don't need it, right? And so it being there is just taking up the space of other useful nutrients. But when we look at the relationship between soil pH and aluminium, the how much of the soil nutrient retention ability is being occupied by plant available aluminium, this is the sort of graph that we get. And this is data from New South Wales, all over New South Wales. And you can see there, things that stick out is basically as you decrease pH, as the soil becomes more acid, you get more and more of this toxic aluminium available to plants. And so the other thing you should see there, it's a big variation. So just because I've got a pH of 4.5, you can't predict what your aluminium is going to be based on that. So you need to look at pH, but you also need to look at this aluminium percentage as well. What that aluminium does is decrease root growth. And so on the screen here, we've got some loosened plants. They'd been established for about 18 months. And on the left-hand side was from an area that had received lime, and on the right-hand side was actually a lime mist. They had a bit of a problem when they were spreading it, and they missed a chunk. And we've got there some cores that we've taken out of the field. We use a little pH indicator that just changes color at different pHs. And so basically purple colors are sort of, around 8, 7.5, 8, green's around 6, and yellow is down around 4. And that's measured in water, the equivalent of water. So in calcium chloride, it's even less than that, because there are two ways of measuring all this, two common ways of measuring pH. And so those little kits, you can buy them from Bunnings for $20. So, it's accessible to everyone to get one of those kits and go out and have a look at what your pHs might be, just as an indication. But you can clearly see there, though, where the lime mist happened, the roots of the lucerne didn't grow. And so, that has implications on water acquisition, nutrient acquisition. In this case, it's a legume, and it also decreases nodulation. So on the left, you can actually see nodules along the roots, little white specks. They're the nodules that are fixing our nitrogen. On the right, in the acid soil, there are none. There are literally no nodules there. So you've got a lucerne that won't fix nitrogen. So that's a waste of space. That root growth, you can look at that and think about, soil biology, the impact that it's going to have, and carbon as well. Of course, if you've got all that aluminium, that's taking up the place in the soil that holds nutrients. And so other good nutrients like magnesium, calcium, potassium, they can all be moved further down the profile, kicked off, if you like, by the aluminium. And so you can end up, even if you're thinking, I've got an acid soil, but it's okay, I'll grow an aluminium tolerant plant. The fact is you'll actually have fewer good nutrients in that soil. And so your production's subpar, and your ability to have that organic matter increase in the soil decreases. There are other advantages to getting rid of that aluminium as well. Phosphate, really important nutrient for plant growth, and especially root growth. Phosphate will bind to aluminium if it's available in the soil, and so your pea fertility decreases in acid soils, and that's a sort of yet another cost. But interestingly, doing this work with acidity and in the field, talking with people, advisors and agronomists, we keep hearing stories about what they're seeing in their lime trial or lime paddocks, or bits where they've missed lime. And what we've also found is that where these acid soils are, it creates, largely due to aluminium, but it creates stress on the plant, which then makes them highly susceptible to disease and pest attack. And so the photograph on the right there is actually some wedge-tail wheat, which we got called out there because the farmer thought that they had a disease, which they did, but we found that the patches where the disease was actually in the acid patches. So in a lot of cases, farmers will see a symptom of poor growth, and it can be due to an aphid attack or a fungal disease. But in a lot of cases, we're finding it's actually an acid soil that's weakened the plant, weakened the system, and made it susceptible to these attacks. And that's something that I don't think a lot of people have got their head around at this point in time. So how do we get these acid soils? Graph here, pH along the x-axis at the top and depth down to 20 centimetres on the y-axis. This is just a little bit of data that we've collected. I work a lot with Helen Burns at New South Wales DPI here in Wagga. And this was a site that Helen found. And I'm going to show you two lines on this graph. One is a black triangle, which came from an undisturbed native pasture, which was actually just on the inside fence of a cemetery. So it had never been under agriculture. On the other side of that fence, though, the paddock was a highly productive paddock, lots of wheat, good canola, legume production, had received lime. But what we've seen there is that in the native pasture area, the virgin soil, if you like, the pH is quite high. You can see it's all above pH 5.5 down to 20 centimetres. But in the agricultural soil, we've actually got this big band of acidity down at sort of 10, 15 centimetres that we call acidic subsurface layers. So they're just underneath the surface and they're acid. The surface is up around 6.5, and that's probably because of those lime applications. But even with those lime applications, we've still got this acidity. So what's driving that? In agriculture, it's largely due to product removal. So if you have a plant growing, basically as that plant grows, the roots will excrete acid into the soil. So the soil becomes more acid. And as part of that relationship, the plant top becomes alkaline in its nature. And so that's happening regardless of the plant largely. And in agriculture, we're all about removing or utilising that above ground plant material. So we take that away as hay, as feed in livestock gets converted to fibre or meat. We remove that. And so if we're removing that alkali from the system, the soil remains to be acid. And so the more, I would say, the better producer you are, the more product you sell or create, the greater the acidification rate is going to be on your soil, just purely on product removal. And then you throw in top of that, in agriculture, we tend to use nitrogen a lot to drive the system. So fertilizers like urea and ammonium will acidify the soil straight up. There's no getting around that. That's what's going to happen. And legumes, when they fix nitrogen, they also acidify soil. And of course, there's a secondary issue there where when you add those fertilizers, you get more plant growth, you'll get more product removal, and you acidify further again. So I'm not saying don't do these things. I'm saying when they happen, we need to acknowledge that we are creating an acid environment, and that's what agriculture is going to do. So what's the impact of that? We did some work, published a paper in 2012. And what we did there, we got data from long-term trials, and they're like hen's teeth for a start because no one likes funding long-term trials. But we got data from 3 long-term trials that were looking at different rotations in our agricultural systems in the southeast of Australia. And we looked at the nitrogen content in the soil, the carbon nitrogen content, the carbon content in the soil, the nitrogen content in the soil, and the soil pH. And so graph here, we've got nitrogen content in the soil on the x-axis and carbon on the y-axis. The 3 boxes are for the 3 different long-term trials. And so when you look at the data, what was really interesting there was you increase soil carbon, you have to increase soil nitrogen. And I know Cassie Schaaf spoke about the carbon nitrogen ratio in the last of these presentations and mentioned a carbon nitrogen ratio of 10, and that's what 10 looks like. And so these are all linked. If you want to increase soil carbon, you need to increase soil nitrogen to do that. You can't get carbon in the soil sequestered without that added nitrogen. The interesting thing was when we look at nitrogen and what it does to pH, we saw this. And so basically as you increase nitrogen on the x-axis, you decrease pH on the y-axis. And so if you want that nitrogen increase, it comes at a cost of acidifying the soil for the reasons I've just mentioned before. And so this work has showed us in our farming systems, if you want to build soil carbon, it actually comes at a cost. And that cost is the extra nutrient that it takes to grow the biomass, extra nitrogen in the system, be it legume nitrogen or fertilizer nitrogen, but the cost of that is actually an acidification. And then that then will have an impact on the fertility of that soil, the biological fertility, because as pH drops, you basically are stripping out biological activity of the system, and removing the diversity, biological diversity in the soil, and limiting it to the organisms that can survive at acid soil or low pH. And then for system health, you'd have to add lime to that soil to bring the pH back up. And of course, lime is a mined product. It has its own carbon footprint. And when you stick it in the soil, it reacts, increases the pH and releases CO2. So it has an economic cost, but it also has a carbon cost as well that we need to start factoring in. So our current management of acidity basically involves soil sampling in 10 centimetre intervals, maybe 10 to 20 as well, but certainly 0 to 10. People are applying lime when the pH gets below about 4.8, and they're doing that because at about 4.8 is when the aluminium starts to come into solution. So the mindset is, I will lime once the aluminium becomes a problem. And then I'll put on enough lime to get it up, get the pH up around 5, because there's a line there, I've got a horizontal line there at about 5%. Most plants can survive below 5% aluminium quite well. Some organisms don't like that. Some rhizobia don't like that. But so they're basically adding just enough lime to make the problem go away, and they're applying lime just as the problem starts to show up and limit production. How much lime is being used comes from often rules of thumb, or it might be an ag fact table that was produced decades ago. And the rule of thumb around here is sort of 2.5 tonnes to the acre every 10 years. 2.5 tonnes to the hectare every 10 years. And that was derived back in the late 80s, because that was roughly the acidification rate of our farming systems. But our farming systems have changed quite a lot since then. We now use a lot more urea. We've got a lot more canola in the system. We've got dual purpose crops. We've had droughts where it was common to cut the entire crop and bale it. And so our acidification rates are a lot higher than what they were back then. And yet we actually, as an industry, we don't have a great idea of that from research, in a research point of view, to quantify that. The ag fact table looks like that, and it's basically, you can see there that the columns go from where your pH starting point is, whether it's 4 or 4.3 or 4.7, to bring it up to 5.2, that is, make the aluminium go away. And each row going down there is cation exchange capacity, which is like a pseudo buffering capacity. So some soils, you can use a little bit of lime to get a change. Other soils that are buffered more strongly, a lot more clay, take a higher rate to get that same change. My point with showing you this table is all of that the gear, the research that's in that table is like 30 years old, was built around putting lime on soil and then rotary hoeing it into 10 centimetres. And then these are the pHs that you expect to get. And so my problem with that is, whilst it's a starting point, no one rotary hoes lime into soil. So it doesn't actually relate terribly well with reality. And so it's quite common to hear people say, oh, I put on 2.5 tonnes of lime per hectare, but I didn't get the pH change. And that's because they just didn't mix it in. So this really isn't working for us. Evidence of that, again, pH on the x-axis, depth to 20 centimetres on the y-axis. And this is some work that Helen Burns and Mark Norton did. And just 2 lines there, one with the triangles, that's sites that had lime in the last 5 years, and the dots are sites that have had lime in, it's more than 5 years ago. And the thing that comes out there is basically all of these sites had lime added to them, but we've still got this nasty acid layer after 10 centimetres. And so we had no impact. Our management, our current best practice management, does nothing to acidity below 10 centimetres. And it's so the system, the plants, are still suffering from that acidity in that acid subsurface layer, even though the producer has spent money trying to rectify the problem. And they've made a difference, but they haven't solved the problem. Now, this has all become an issue for us because until recently, we didn't know that this was happening, that our management practices weren't addressing the problem. And that was because we measure pH in these 10 centimetre intervals. And so that dot line, the 0 to 10 centimetre layer for that the pH was 4.6. And at 4.6, you would say, oh, I need to lime, and that's fine. But you'd put on your rules of thumb, or you'd use the table and you put the lime on, and that's not going to address pH down at 10 or 15 centimetres. That triangle line, the 0 to 10 sample, its pH was 5.3. So a lot of using those same management practices of trying to avoid aluminium, liming to around 5, you would not lime that soil. And so you would farm continually on into the future thinking that everything was good. And yet we've still got this nasty acid layer that's limiting production, limiting your plant's ability to get roots down, which might be the difference between a good start if you have a drier season at the start of the year, being able to get roots further down into subsoil could be the difference, you know. So using these 0 to 10 centimetre layers, we've actually masked the presence of these acid layers. So a lot of people who have been soil sampling, who have been putting on lime, have still got a problem they don't know about. And so what we're saying is, much like that graph, we've actually sampled that in 5 centimetre intervals, and that's how we know we've got that curve there. And we went to 20 centimetres, so that's what we know, how we know what the pH is, where that nasty acid layer is. So 5 centimetre intervals is worthwhile. And just to prove that fact to you, another graph, on the x-axis is that pH of the 0 to 10 centimetre layer, much like you would get if you send your soil off to get a soil test done. The pH comes back in that 10 centimetre layer. So what the value on the x-axis is your soil test value. What the y-axis is for within that 10 centimetre layer, we measured pH in 2.5 centimetre intervals. And within any 10 centimetre layer, we found wherever the most acid layer is, what is the pH in the most acid layer within the top 10 centimetres? Let's put that pH on this graph. So our x-axis is what is the average, if you like, or what is the 0 to 10 based on the soil test value, and the y-axis is what is the most acid layer within that 10 centimetre layer, 10 centimetre zone. And so if your soil test value, your x-axis, if it was really good at finding the acid layer, all your data points would fit on this one-to-one line. So if your data points fit on this line, I can use 10 centimetre increments to tell me what my most acid layer is. Does my 10 centimetre interval find the acidity in the 10 centimetre layer? When you put our data across that, it looks like that. And so you'll note that there are very few of them actually go anywhere near that one-to-one line. And so you can see there's a dot there around pH 6 on the x-axis. So our soil test value said that that was pH 6, but in reality, in the top 10 centimetres, that soil had a pH of 4.3 in a 2.5 centimetre layer, somewhere in the top 10 centimetres. And that would be enough. That could stop a legume from fixing nitrogen. That could stop, nitrogen cycling organisms, or it could, just stress a plant enough for it to get a disease. So that's a real problem for us. Same data, same idea, except here on the x-axis, we've got the pH done in 5 centimetre intervals. And so that's the 0 to 5 centimetre layer, and this is the 5 to 10 centimetre layer. So my point here is when you're measuring the same soil in 5 centimetre intervals, your 5 centimetre interval actually identifies the true risk, or the most acid layer, the acidity in the most acid layer. So it's a better tool to actually find your problem. So just to summarize, this is saying if we use 10 centimetre intervals, which is the industry practice at the moment, you spend the money getting a sampling, you get a number, but the number doesn't actually identify your problem. And that's a massive problem, because you're going to go and pull a trigger on management, either sowing a type of crop or inputs, lime or other fertilizer, thinking that you don't have a problem that you do. And that could really hurt you, especially in a suboptimal year, weather-wise, which we get more of now. So being able to identify the most acid layer is a big deal for us. 5 centimetre intervals does that. Once we identify it, what can we do about it? And so we've done some work here. This is work from an honours student of mine, Tom Price. And what he did was he found a soil on DPI research station here in Wagga. This is its pH profile. Again, you see that stratified pH, really nasty acid zone around 10 centimetres down. And he was basically saying, right, well, can we just put lime in that acid layer? And the way of practically doing that in an easy way with gear that farmers already have is using prilled lime, so a manufactured product, prilled lime, and actually putting it through a seeder into the layer that is the most acid layer. And so he did that and compared it against just putting lime on the surface and mixing that lime in. So mixed lime at 2 tonnes to the hectare looks like that. So it increased pH, but only down to about 7 centimetres, even though he thought incorporation went to about 10. The lime didn't work down very far, and that's pretty common. And so, yep, liming increased pH, but it didn't, in the year of application, it didn't improve or rectify that really nasty acidity at 10 to 15 centimetres. With the prilled lime, at 300 kilograms per hectare, drilled into the seed row or just underneath the seed row, the triangle and dotted line is what happened there. So he did actually get rid of a lot of that nasty acidity. We didn't get rid of all of it in that first year, but that simple application made a big difference to a 15 centimetre depth, or 12.5 centimetre depth. And so from an economic point of view, the cost of 2.5 tonnes of lime spread on the surface or 300 kilograms of prilled lime drilled in was about the same, okay? The negative is the pH was only ameliorated on the sowing row. There's gaps in between that still have acid soil. And so we've got research done with growers now where we're actually combining these two. We're mixing lime on the surface to get coverage over time, but we're putting calcipril or prilled lime in underneath the sowing row to fix the acidity for the crop that we're sowing, pasture, perennial pasture that we're establishing now, because we want to get a head start to get rid of the acidity. To give you an idea of what that does to roots, so this is Tom's trial, fava beans. Control, we got these nasty, what are called J roots. So they basically grew down, hit a bunch of aluminium, and they grow sideways. And so, smaller plant, smaller root zone has impacts on, should have impacts on carbon, should have impacts on biology in the soil as well, because if you don't get roots further down, there's nothing for those bugs to eat or work on. And so calcipril works, mixed liming worked, but doing nothing clearly wasn't a good idea. In circumstances where you don't want to incorporate, it might be because of erosion risk or your perennial system. You're basically relying on line movement to move alkali deeper into the soil to deal with that acidity. And so I want to show you some data here. This is work done literally 30 years ago. And what they did, they mixed lime in at 3 rates, either 0, 2 tonne or 8 tonne. And they mixed in with the rotary hoe and down to about 8 centimetres. They grew or sowed subclover into it, and then they came back 5 years later and soil sampled. And this is the pH on the x-axis is pH, depth down to 16 centimetres on the y-axis. And so the control, they had nothing added to it. pH looked like that. So again, you get this stratification with this nasty acid layer. In this case, around 4 to 10 centimetres. The little eye there near 8 is the depth of incorporation that they got, the depth that the rotary hoe went into. At 2 tonnes to the hectare, the pH increased. And again, that 2 tonne to the hectare was all about getting rid of aluminium. But when you lime to that point, to just bring the pH up on average to around 5 somewhere, you don't actually get any pH increase below that depth of incorporation. When you increase to 8 tonnes, the pH increased below the depth of incorporation. So you can see there's quite a significant increase in pH down to 12 centimetres. And so unfortunately, when that work was done, what people took away from that was, if you want lime to move down, you have to put high rates on. 8 tonnes of lime is a lot of lime, high rates of lime. And everyone said, well, no, it's bloody ridiculous. Like, that's going to cost heaps. No one's going to do that. Unfortunately, when you read the paper, what it actually says is if you want that alkali to move down, the pH has to be up over 5.5. Okay, now in this soil, because it was so acid, to get it up over 5.5, you needed 8 tons of lime. But I just want to give you this message now. If you are already close to 5.5, it takes a very small amount of lime to get over 5.5. Okay, so pH is a logarithmic scale, so there's a lot more acid. There's, like, if you go from pH 6 to pH 5, there's 10 times more acidity at pH 5 than 6. But if you then go to 4, there's 100 times more acid than 6. So if you let the soil acidify, it's going to take a lot of lime to bring it up. But if you start and actually start treating the soil before it gets very acid, it takes smaller amounts of lime to get a bigger pH change. Rightio. So this 5.5 is a big deal. We need to, if we want lime to move, it's got to be, pH has to be over 5.5 if you expect the lime to move, the alkali from the lime to move. Demonstrating that, just some conceptual data here from a trial that was reported in 2019 by Gwandi Lee at DPI. Here, this is a long-term trial. And what I want to show you here is soil pH on the y-axis, years that the trial went for on the x-axis. And the two boxes here is 0 to 10 centimetres and 10 to 20 centimetres. And so what happens, there's plenty of data to show this, is if you lime to get rid of aluminium, so you lime to get over pH 5 and let agriculture then acidify down over 6-8 years to a point where aluminium, you get to 4.8, aluminium starts coming back into solution. Lime again, pH goes up, let agriculture happen, it acidifies down, lime again, pH goes up. So we have these what we call maintenance rates of lime to hit whatever your target was. In this case, the target was to get over, keep on average about 5. So aluminium's not a problem. That's common practice. That's what people have been doing if they lime. The issue is that at 10 to 20, when that happens, because the alkali doesn't move down, because you're never getting over 5.5, the acidity or the pH in the 10 to 20 actually decreases with time. And so we're actually making our system worse. In this case, we're spending money, we're doing all the right things, but our system's actually degrading in the 10 to 20 centimetre layer. And that's not sustainable. It's not good practice. Compare that to, and this is Gwandi's data, if you set the target up, so the pH is up around 5.5, same thing, you raised it. In this case, it was a larger, it was 3.7 tonnes of lime to get the pH up over 5.5. Let agricultural acidify down, re-lime, acidify down, re-lime. So we've still got these maintenance rates, but we've had a bigger capital injection of lime at the start to get up over 5.5. Okay, so the comparison in the 0 to 10 is purely what I set the pH target to be, and the cost really is that additional upfront liming event. In this case, 3.7 tonnes compared to 2.5 tonnes. So not a ridiculous quantity of lime and not a huge cost. But that's the difference you get in pH. And really, really importantly, in the 10 to 20 centimetre layer, when that happens, the pH goes up. And so over 18 years, the pH increased by about 0.9 of a unit in the 10 to 20 centimetre layer. All of that lime in the surface was surface applied, except for that very first one, which was incorporated in when the pastures were established. So that's doable, right? That's doable for producers to do. So here on the right, you've got a system benefit, a long-term sustainability increase, which is driven by one liming event at establishment of this, in this case, perennial pasture. Okay, and not a huge cost, but a huge benefit to the system. And you can stand there, I can put that data in front of people, and you can show this land management improves the natural resource. Still productive, still making money, but you're actually leaving the place better off. So we're doing a bunch of work, little red dots on a map there, just saying where we're operating. And we're saying we know we need to be liming above pH 5.5 in calcium chloride. What's the best way to get there? So there's lots of little projects that add together to this work. But just to summarize that, basically what we've got trials that are on farm or on research station. And we've got controls where we don't add lime. We've got liming to get rid of aluminium, that pH 5.2, so it's a current farmer practice, if you like. And then we've got liming to around 6, that is maintaining the pH up over 5.5. So they're common to pretty much all of our trials. And then we've got, in situations where maybe there's no cultivation, perennial pastures, we're saying, right, if you're going to put on lime, which is calculated to ameliorate 10 centimetres of soil, but you're only ever putting it on the surface, then maybe we don't need to put all of that out at one time. Maybe smaller amounts more often will actually keep the pH up over 5.5, but not high enough that lime won't dissolve anymore. So it's kind of this sweet spot where you get the maximum amount of alkali movement down. So we're testing that. In areas where you can incorporate, we're mixing lime in, and that's done by various implements. We've got trials that look at different implements to do that. When you talk to people, one of the negatives or one of the pushbacks you get about incorporation is that there's a risk to damage the soil structure. Research has shown that that's a very minor thing, but people feel it, so that's fine. And there's also an erosion risk if you're on sloped land. And so we've also got this, what we call once in a generation treatment, where it's quite a high lime rate to get rid of the acidity to the depth of incorporation. And in some cases, like on the screen there, we're using pretty serious gear, and that depth of incorporation is like 20 centimeters, like 18 centimeters. And we're basically saying that if you are going to incorporate, reward the risk by putting on enough lime to make a big difference. Okay, so there's almost, it's a bad thing to do all the cultivation, but just not put on enough lime to actually make a difference. So we're testing this once in a generation application as well. Just quickly, these are 3 sites that we have in this suite of trials. You've got a row there for the pH in the 5 to 15 centimetre layer, and then you've got the amount of lime for these different treatments, hitting pH 5.2, getting over 5.5, little bits and often in the 0 to 5, or the once in a generation. What you see there, as you go from left to right with those sites, you're actually getting less acidic. So Lyndhurst is much more acidic than Toogong. What I want you to see there is have a look at the lime rates. To do the exact same thing, to achieve the same goals, you use a lot less lime if you start the intervention early, right? So if you're sitting there thinking, yeah, I've got some acid soils, but my other soils, they're pretty good, don't forget the good ones, because it's cheaper to maintain the good ones now than let them degrade to a point where it's going to be very expensive to fix. Okay, so the sooner you deal with acidity, the cheaper it's going to be for you for the same gains. Just quickly, just to finish up, to just give you an idea of, like, I've got soil data, but picture tells 1,000 words. So this is at Morven down near Holbrook. You can see this is canola. This is dual purpose canola. Note the nil, small plants, yellowing on the leaf, that's manganese toxicity. So not only is aluminium toxic, but manganese is toxic in acid soils as well. So where we didn't lime, we got hit by manganese toxicity. On the other ones, you can see that where we've limed, you can just get much more root growth. And if you put more lime on, you even get more finer, especially the finer roots. And that's producing, that's a carbon source for microbes, ability to pick up more nutrients. And of course, incorporating makes a big difference as well. So the INC is incorporated, NI is not incorporated. And on the very right-hand side of the screen, you can see at 4 tonnes. So those 2 plants on the right-hand side, the same cost of lime went onto them, but you get a much better root zone where you've incorporated because you've mixed that lime through. And you can see on the shovel, the little pH indicator, there's lots of yellow where 4 tonnes have gone onto the surface, but it hasn't been mixed through. So if you can incorporate, it's definitely a good idea to do that. Now, interestingly, we went and sampled plant tissue of those plants, and what you see there is parts per million of nitrate in the plant. So they all received the same urea application, top dress urea, but the limed treatments had a lot more nitrate in the leaf tissue. And so we looked at this because we're interested in terms of animal health. But what we walked away thinking was lime actually makes a big difference to nitrogen utilization. So the fertilizer that you put out, you get rewarded for it more when you've limed. More of that nitrogen gets its way into the plant. And this is kind of like, one way of looking at that is, if I lime, I might be able to reduce my nitrogen applications, right? Because my system's more efficient. It's using the nutrients in the soil more efficiently. So we've got another honours student looking at that in more detail this year in a paddock nearby. But yeah, so liming's not just about increasing pH, getting rid of aluminium, but it actually has all these side benefits like increased nutrient efficiency, which means that your system becomes more efficient. Nutrient cycling becomes more efficient. Same trial. On the left is a nil plot. On the right is 4 tons of lime incorporated. There are all these weeds in the nil plot because the plants didn't take off, didn't get established really well. They struggled because of the acidity. Where we limed, the plants bolted, they took off, established really well, shaded out, competed all the weeds. So you've limed and now you don't have the weed burden. So you've now got a herbicide saving. And just on that too, with that pH stratification, we know that pH impacts on herbicide degradation rates. And so actually understanding what your real pH is makes a big difference to your plant back times of following some herbicides. So there's other benefits to just getting rid of aluminium, weed impact as well. Residual benefit, this is a satellite image of a plot at Charles Sturt Uni. What you can see there, the horizontal stripes, bands, if you like, are just 1 hectare plots that were used for teaching. But what this had, it had a historic lime event that was done in strips in about 1989. And this was taken, I think from memory, in 2006. And those dark green bands that you see is actually lucerne. And so where the dark green is where the 1989 liming event happened. And in between that, it didn't receive lime. So this paddock got lime in these strips in 1989, got lime again in about 2007 over everything. And this is a photo taken from 2019. And up near where the road is, you can see that's peas, field peas. And again, you can see the dark green compared to the light green. There was 3 times the biomass on the dark green, and it's all driven by a liming event that happened in 1989. The lucerne on the left, that was through the millennium drought. So you actually had good pasture growth when you needed pasture. Yeah, so lime repays you when you need it most. You get these big differences when it's a bad season. So, and that's why I talk about resilience. Like there's lots of things that stops plants from growing, building biomass in the soil. You know, there's soil fertility, there's weather, disease, whatnot. You can get rid of an awful lot of those things by addressing soil pH. So it sets up a foundation that then you can build on. But in a rough start, getting seedlings germinating in a way really strongly is super important to survival. And that's, you know, get rid of acidity, take that off the table. You're just setting your system up so much better. 4 soils. On the left, dotted line, that's an acid soil. You would lime that. Most people would lime that. Next one along, triangles with the red line. Borderline, some people would lime that, some people wouldn't, depending on their idea of prioritization. The 2 lines on the right in our current systems wouldn't get limed, but I'm just telling you that that second from the right, that dashed line, there is a soil that is showing the start of an acid subsurface layer. It is cheaper to fix that now than wait until that line looks like the extreme left. So we need to maintain our good, high productive soils now before we get a problem. And so our current practices don't work, right? They don't address the deeper problem. 10 centimetre sampling masks the effect or the presence of these acid subsurface layers, so you don't even know you've got a problem. 5 centimetre intervals actually finds them. So people say, oh, it takes extra time and extra money. Yes, but you get a number that's actually worthwhile. 10 centimetre sampling takes time and money as well, but it gives you a number that doesn't mean anything. Maintaining the pH above 5.5 maximises the opportunity for alkali to move down. And if we set the reliming trigger point at 5.5, it's going to cost less to maintain our soil in a healthy condition for longer. And in doing that, we need to ensure that we're not going to let our best paddocks slip through the cracks. We're not going to let our good paddocks degrade. We need to be looking after them. By addressing this acidity, you're basically creating a resilience in your system because you're taking away stresses from plants, which then relate to microbial activity as well. By maintaining that pH, getting rid of those acid subsurface layers, you're giving your grower or yourself there's more options on the table because pH is no longer limiting you. Whereas if you give in to the acidity and just go, yep, it's too expensive to fix, you get more and more acidity. Aluminium becomes a problem. You're going to get hit by disease more often. In those seasons where you don't get a really good start, your crops are going to suffer. You don't have the crop options. You're just relying on only the ones that will survive. And it's pretty hard, if that's the attitude, it's pretty hard to sit there and say, we're leaving the place in a better condition than when we started. So I'll leave it there. Peter, I just want to thank all my collaborators. It's really great working with these people. So there's some brilliant people out there. We've got some fantastic land managers that we work with and often super innovative and driving the system as well. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Jason. That's really quite an eye-opener. I've been putting out lime, I guess, I don't know, since the mid-80s, I guess, whenever it started. And I'm pretty sure we've been doing it the wrong way. Anyway, that was quite an eye-opener. So I've got a few questions. I'll do the ones in the chat first because there's two there and they're both similar, and I won't lose them that way. Julia asks, can the effect be mirrored using a yeoman's plough and improving soil condition by removing compaction? And then sort of on the same line, Jane is asking, is there any research on impacts of soil compaction on lime transport into the subsoil?
Yeah, so we have treatments which have incorporated and not incorporated for the same lime rate, which kind of gets you and different implements. We haven't got a yeoman's plough. That's not one of them, but we can in our in some of our trials we can separate a compaction effect from a pH effect for sure, and largely I would say from our experience doing these trials, the cultivation, even when you don't think you've got a compacted layer, creates a bunch of benefits. You see it in root growth. So we all get a increase in root growth just from cultivation compared to a do nothing plot. And that could be the physical nature. It could also be pH is stratified, but phosphorus is stratified, carbon is stratified, microbial activity is stratified. So cultivating the soil actually mixes all that up and does some fantastic things for chemical and biological fertility. And so sometimes it's hard to pick which bit of that cultivation is driving the benefit. But just to clarify too, we've still, in the plots where we've got no lime addition with cultivation and lime addition with cultivation, we are able to say what the added benefit is of that additional lime. And the cultivation, is sitting, I had it in the data, but I tweeted out, but where you cultivate, you definitely mix lime in further, and that's definitely a benefit. You're getting a head start over just waiting for it to wash down or move down from a surface application for sure. So I always say, if you can cultivate, if it fits the rotation, fits your farming practice, and the risk associated with erosion can be kept in check, you would work your lime in for sure. And it's not like you're cultivating every year. You're doing it once maybe every 8-10 years, so there's a lot to like.
All Right. Have another question here. How effective is green fertiliser crop rotation, as in the European farms, in maintaining good pH and carbon?
So green fertiliser, like, just help me out. Is that like manuring, that sort of stuff?
Oh, I'm guessing they're talking about green manuring, yeah.
Yeah. So basically, just thinking about how the system works, if you are bringing in organic material from somewhere else and putting it into your system, that organic material is an alkali source. So you could mix that in, you're going to get biological benefit, production benefit, water holding benefit, and the pH should increase initially as that organic matter breaks down. If it's just organic matter grown in the paddock, then you've got the alkali in the plant came at the cost of acidity in the soil. And so if you plow that back in, you're just going to neutralize some of the acidity that you've already created. So, you know, it's not as bad as removing the product out of the paddock, but you're not going to get a net gain, a net benefit in pH from that. But bringing material in, you'll get an initial increase. We've done work where we've done that. And if that material has a lot of nitrogen in it, your gain in pH quickly gets exchanged with a bit of a decrease in pH, as well as that nitrogen then adds acidity to the system. So yeah, we've done that. We've in some cases added like 15 tons of organic matter, and you get an initial increase, and fast forward like 5 weeks, 6 weeks, you're back to where you started because the nitrogen system acidifies again. If the organic matter that you're adding doesn't have so much nitrogen, then the pH stays up higher for longer.
Yeah. Now, Mike has asked, we commercially map acidity and other soil characteristics spatially, and we know there is a massive spatial variation in soil acidity as other nutrients. This spatial variability exists at depth and on the surface, and he's been involved in the research. Could you comment on the benefits of mapping and ameliorating acid soil spatially? It's not that expensive.
So let me just do that to you. So this is a bit of work that Michael Moody did when he was at CSU. And so this is grid sampling, if you like, every 10 centimetres. So on the left, that's a metre by a metre, sampled every 10 centimetres. In the middle is 10 metres, sampled every metre. And on the right is 100 metre, sampled every 10 metres. And different colours being different pHs on the right-hand side. And so I look at that, and if you didn't know what the scale was, you'd say that's pretty much the same, right? So the variability that happens within a 10 centimetre 10 by 10 grid is about as much as what happens in a 10 by, like 100 metre by 100 metre grid. Okay, so Mike's point's spot on. There's a lot of spatial variability. That's worse in pasture systems. In cropping systems, we manipulate the spatial variability by how we sow. So if you're sowing by GPS steering, sowing in the same place, you actually are spatially changing the soil within the drill rows. And work that we've done has shown that after 5 years of doing that, we had half a pH unit difference between on the row and between the row, simply because of plant growth fertilizer application. And so we created spatial variability in that case, and that impacts how you sample. So on a paddock scale, and I should say that work that's on the screen now, you know, that's not new. I know Mark Conyers did that in the 80s, and I know that someone else did that in the 1930s, and we all found the same thing. You get just as much variability in a little bit as you do in a big bit. What do you do with that? I always say that if you think of a paddock or think of a landscape, think of your property, you have variation within that area, right? And soils are variable, but they are variable for a reason. Okay, so the variability that you see on the screen there, they are variable for a reason. It might be organic matter return, sheep dung, urine, plants growth. You know, there's lots of things going on. On a larger scale, you'll have variation in soil type, soil depth, maybe due to topography, how soils developed, how water drains through them. The variability happens for a reason, and we can predict the reason, and that enables us to then identify zones which are likely to be similar or likely to be different. And then I'd say if you want an idea of managing spatially, then my preference is to look at these sampling zones or management zones, which are predictable based on things that change where soils are. If you don't have great soil knowledge and you don't know what those things are, you've got yield maps, you've got satellite imagery, you've got your own observations of a paddock that you know behaves differently in different years or different parts. You know, in a wet year down the bottom, it's always going to do this, but in a dry year, that's a better yield or whatever it is. You know where differences exist. So treat them as a separate soil and sample them differently, see what the differences are. I know some people spend an awful lot of money sampling pH spatially, often in 10 centimetre layers, and I've shown you, hopefully you got it from my earlier graph, comparing 10 centimetres and 5 centimetres. You'll get a number, you spent money getting that number, but it's going to miss the presence of these acid layers, you know, and so that's a bad outcome because you spend a heap of money that isn't helping you. So I'd much prefer definitely measuring those 5 centimetre intervals, definitely go to 20 centimetres, but do it on these management zones or sampling zones, which you've identified as plants grow differently there. And so if it's big enough difference in that soil to make a difference in the plant, then go sample where those plants are different, those different crop growth or pasture growth areas. And then, you know, in a lot of cases, sometimes that variability might actually be driven by something deeper in the subsoil. It might be 50 centimetres down, not in the top 10 centimetres anyway. So I'm not sure if that helps, Mike. You probably don't like what I had to say, but I just think that spatially, there's cheap ways of getting information about where soils change, their impact on how that spatial variability then impacts on plants and where yields are different or plant growth is different. And then you can go and identify what the differences are in a fairly cheap way by just sampling by a zone. You can still make maps that way too.
All right. Now I've got two questions. Oh no, they're both by the same person, so obviously they're the same. But anyway, are you monitoring the impact of liming on soil carbon stocks?
Yeah, great question, and I didn't touch on that. So in all of our trials that we've got going at the moment, we are looking in 2.5 centimetre intervals. So we're never expecting anyone commercially to do that, but that's what we're doing in research, because we are interested in how quickly that liming effect is moving down. We're looking at phosphorus fertility and soil carbon. So in our routine sampling, we go to 30 centimetres. We do the top 15 centimetres in 2.5 centimetre intervals. We then do 15 to 20 as a layer and 20 to 30 as a layer. And we measure soil pH, exchangeable cations, including aluminium, carbon, and coal wall P. So yeah, and at this stage, I can't report massive differences in carbon due to our treatments because it's early days yet. But yeah, that's our starting point. And some of the work that I've done with Helen and the Grasslands Association, we've got like 60 monitoring sites where we've sampled like that, so that we can go back periodically, 3 years, 5 years, whatever we get funding for, to look at the impact on practice with on pH, coal P, and carbon.
All right. Michael would like to know when your research is likely to be completed. I suspect it's going to be ongoing, but anyway.
I hope to work for another 15 years or something. Yeah, so various projects will complete. We've published some stuff, and I've got a slide there with some key readings. So published some stuff regarding pH stratification in Southeast Australia, but those trials that I spoke about with the different methods of incorporation, those a lot of the image I showed you on the university campus here from a liming event in 1989, we're still getting results now. So the sites that we've got are actually a resource for future generations in a lot of cases. So we will report research as we get the findings, but hopefully the work continues well into the future.
I'll ask that one as well. Andrew would like to know, how important is planting of deep-rooted species after that into initially heavy liming, and how effective are plants at changing soil pH at depth?
Yeah, so plants can change pH at depth. To do that, they need to take up negatively charged nutrients, so nitrate, sulfate at depth. That's really hard to control. You can't really manage that. It's too opportunistic in a way. You can't predict rainfall events. So deep-rooted plants, in the past, people have said, oh, if I've got deep-rooted plants, it takes up the nitrate and I don't acidify. All the research shows that that's not true. You'll still get acidity at the surface where the nitrate was formed. As a profile, there might be less acidity in it, but up the top, in that nasty little subsurface layer, that's where the acidity formed, because that's where the nitrate was created. The fact that it was taken up by a deeper root at some point further down the profile doesn't change the pH up where the nitrate was formed. So even if you've got deep-rooted plants, deep-rooted perennials, your system will still acidify. And the research shows that actually it acidifies at the same rate as an annual. In our trials, we've seen that. It's beneficial for a lot of other reasons, like in terms of taking up nutrients, nutrient utilization, keeping a living plant in the system for a lot longer. There's lots of other benefits. So, but I just wanted to make sure that people realize that it's not, I have perennial plants, therefore acidity is not my problem. That's not a conversation, that's not a statement that can be made. Okay, there are other benefits, but it doesn't get rid of acidity. Moving line down, I've got no data on that. Yeah, like there's a hypothesis there that if you've got big chunky roots like a chicory or a radish or something like that, it leaves a big hole that line might be able to move through. I get that, but I've got no data to support it. But in theory, it's something that could happen.
Now we might make this the last question. It comes from Julia, and it's about if you're core sampling for carbon projects, and these cores are 1.2 meters deep, is this an additional tool to determine pH and treating each layer?
It's a stupid answer, but probably depends on the soil. Sorry, but yeah. So in a lot of our soils, all the action's higher up. You hit the clay, and then the pH goes up. In some cases, if you're doing those cores, that little pH kit that I showed you that you can get from Bunnings, I'd be having a crack at, like, push the core out and then put that on the core, or take soil from various layers of the core and just have a look just to see how much the pH changes. And then it comes down to your budget, whether you can separate, put it in different layers to find out, send it off to a lab as separate layers to find out what the pH is. pH is cheap to do, but yeah, it's an opportunity, I guess, Julia, to find out what the pH is, but lower down. But a lot of the action happens higher up, and you have a look at like the papers that we've written. Like a lot of the pH change happens in the top 20 centimeters, really.
All right. Well, thank you, Jason, for that. That's one of the more informative talks I think I've heard on acid soils for a long while. So congratulations on your work, and keep doing more of it. And hopefully we'll see some papers and things and try and stay up to date. But just before we finish, I'd like to thank all the attendees for attending, and to let them know that this will be a recorded webinar, so you'll be able to go to the website and look it up if you want to check on details that you might have missed. I'd also like to recommend that people who want to keep up with what we're doing in Farmers for Climate Action, go to our website and join our organisation. It doesn't cost anything, and we will endeavour to keep you informed of the latest research on carbon and climate change and all these sorts of things. We'll be having more of these webinars over the years. But generally, thanks very much for attending, and especially to you, Jason. That was a really interesting talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.